Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over two cases of people who went missing and were found years later. And when they were found, the circumstances of their disappearance were far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The second story in particular is one of the most horrific stories that's ever been covered on this channel. So although it's fleeting and non-descriptive, it's still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Joyce Carol Vincent was known as a living beam of light to all those who knew her. With a father from India and a mother from Africa, Joyce's physical features included a dark complexion, big brown eyes, and long curly hair, and she was a showstopper everywhere she went. Beyond her physical beauty though, if she gave you the time of day, it was her personality that really hooked you. She was kind, bubbly, and always looking to squeeze as much as she could out of life. In a single word, Joyce was unforgettable. Born on October 19, 1965 in London's Hammersmith area, she was the youngest of 5 girls, making her the baby of the family. Her parents had emigrated to London from Grenada, and she was the only member of her family that was actually born in the UK. The family was a middle-class, blue-collar one, and Joyce's father was a hard-working and skilled carpenter who supported the family on a single income. And it's said that Joyce picked up her magnetism from her father, as he always seemed to attract all sorts of people for his personality and charm. Despite their commonalities, however, her father was said to be an emotionally distant father, so Joyce gravitated more toward her mother. Tragically, however, her mother passed away when Joyce was just 11 years old, leaving her 4 sisters to try to fill the void in raising her. But even still, life after her mother's death got a bit rocky for Joyce once she hit her teenage years. Until she was 16 years old, she attended an all-girls school in London, but she suddenly dropped out and never received a degree. For what Joyce planned for her life, however, she didn't need one. Regardless of some of the hardships in her upbringing, Joyce never stopped fostering big dreams for herself as a musician. More than anything, she wanted to be a pop star, and after leaving school, she started to make a lot of new friends in the music industry. She would end up having the chance to record a few songs in the studio. She once had lunch with Stevie Wonder, and when she was 25, she appeared in a video with Nelson Mandela during a tribute show for him at Wembley Stadium. But as well positioned as she was to start making her own way in the music business, Joyce never seemed to get her footing in. As she chased this dream of hers, she worked day jobs to support herself. She started in 1985 as a secretary for an overseas container company in London before moving on to a global professional services firm called Ernst & Young. Having never graduated from high school, you might think that Joyce's work there was menial at best, but she very quickly climbed her way up in the company. Before long, she was working in the Treasury Department with the responsibility of moving large amounts of money around the company. And it should be no surprise that Joyce was popular among her colleagues at work. Not only was she hardworking and reliable, but her personality just brightened everyone's day. Considering this, it was heartbreaking when in 2001, Joyce abruptly quit the company without giving anyone a solid reason as to why. And then after leaving Ernst & Young, it was like this popular, promising woman simply vanished off the face of the earth. But for those who knew Joyce a bit better than her coworkers, this wasn't necessarily out of character for her. You see, the group of people she hung out with was ever rotating, not because Joyce was on the outs with anyone, but because she just had a tendency to jump from one social circle to another. It wasn't odd for one of her groups of friends to spend a night out with Joyce and then not hear from her for a good while. So when she appeared, only to inevitably disappear again, her friends just shrugged it off as Joyce being Joyce. However, when she left Ernst & Young suddenly in 2001, this was around the same time she actually started to distance herself from her family and friends. Usually, if Joyce departed from one friend group, she could be found in another, but that wasn't the case this time. Instead, it's believed that she had been in a romantic relationship with a man for a couple of years up to that point, and he was the reason for her pulling away from everyone else in her life. After leaving the company, Joyce reportedly moved into a shelter for victims of domestic violence, and her isolation could have simply been the product of not wanting anyone to know what she was going through. She may have felt shame around being a victim, or it could have been that she just didn't want the man who had been doing this to her to know her whereabouts. And sadly, during this time as well, Joyce started to live a life of underachievement for someone who had accomplished so much during her career. She took a job as a maid at a run-down motel, and after spending several years at the shelter, she moved into a one-room flat above the Wood Green Shopping Centre in London. This was owned by the Metropolitan Housing Trust and reserved specifically for victims like Joyce. In November of 2003, Joyce had a bit of a health scare and she was admitted to the hospital after vomiting blood as a result of a peptic ulcer. However, after 2 days there, she was stable enough to return to her studio flat on her own, where she continued to reside. In early 2006, the Housing Trust noticed something odd about Joyce's account that had gone unseen to that point. Because half of her rent money was coming from the government through housing benefits, the system didn't flag the fact that the other half of her monthly payments weren't coming in for more than 2 years. When they finally became aware of this, the Housing Trust had no choice but to collect the unpaid rent totaling £2,400 or repossess the property. On January 25, 2006, authorities arrived at Joyce's flat to formally kick her out of the property. When they approached her door, they noticed that the TV was so loud that it could easily be heard in the hallway, indicating that Joyce was occupying the flat. Several attempts to get her to answer the door were then made, but other than the blaring television, there were no signs of movement inside her apartment. Then, after giving her sufficient time to come to the door and let them in, authorities began kicking at it. A few swift hard kicks broke it open, and as police stepped inside, they had to do so over a mound of unread mail sitting in the doorway. Immediately, they could see that the apartment was somewhat messy and unorganized, but Joyce had also taken great care in wrapping a pile of gifts that she must have planned to deliver to friends and family at one point. Some reports say that she was found lying on the floor, and others say that she was in her bed, but tragically, Joyce was found dead. That much was immediately and abundantly clear. This is because whenever Joyce passed away, her death had taken place so long ago that her remains were mostly skeletonized. And that's about where the clarity surrounding her death stops. How she died was not immediately apparent, and initially authorities couldn't even be certain it was her because of how badly decomposed she was by that point. Her body was in such a state that a full autopsy couldn't be performed, but the coroner did manage to use her dental records to positively identify the body as belonging to Joyce. Joyce apparently suffered from bouts of asthma, so it was possible that she could have passed away as a result of an asthma attack. Or because she was dealing with a peptic ulcer that had gotten so bad at one point that she had to be hospitalized, this was another possibility. A further review of the apartment by police revealed very little for them to suspect foul play was involved. There were no signs of a break-in, and the front door was even double locked. The only other way to leave the flat was through the window, but the apartment was located in a complex in such a way that this was not a very likely scenario. So, with nothing at all to sway the police in that direction, they ruled her cause of death as a result of natural causes. On her death certificate, the coroner simply listed it as unascertained. During the investigation by police, several of Joyce's neighbors were interviewed, but none of them ever noticed anything out of the ordinary. She was known to keep to herself, and her neighbors rarely saw her. It was also a rather loud building with thin walls, so blaring television wasn't enough to spark any complaints. And Joyce's apartment also sat just above the outside dumpsters, so the smell that came from her flat after she died was attributed to the garbage. When police looked into how her TV service, heat, water, and electricity were still operational, they discovered that Joyce had set everything up to automatically come out of her account every month, so none of those companies had a reason to reach out to her. The best clues as to when Joyce passed away were actually found inside the flat itself. When police searched her kitchen, they opened her refrigerator to find extremely spoiled food in containers marked with expiration dates all the way back in 2003. This meant she died just before Christmas 2003. Then for more than 2 years afterward, Joyce's body lay inside the flat without anyone ever reporting her missing or coming by to check on her. Upon hearing the news of Joyce's death, friends and family members alike were stunned. She had grown reclusive and isolated in the last 2 years of her life, but she never went unloved. In the years that Joyce's body lay dead in her apartment, her sisters tried to get in touch with her through letters that went unanswered. They even hired a private detective to locate her, but this was obviously an unsuccessful effort. When all else failed, her family could only assume that Joyce had abandoned them, and out of love, they decided to give her the space they believed she was after. So, her habit of disappearing and reappearing in the lives of those who knew her is the best explanation of how someone so unforgettable could have gone so tragically forgotten. It was a normal Sunday afternoon on October 6, 2002 in Richwoods, Missouri, when 11-year-old Shawn was starting to get antsy. He was getting bored and restless, so around 1 p.m. he went to his stepfather Craig and asked if he could ride his bike over to his friend's house. This was something Shawn had done countless times, and his friend didn't live too far away, so Craig didn't give it a second thought before smiling and telling his stepson he had permission to go play. Shawn then hopped up and went over to his mother Pam to give her a hug and kiss before he left. She told him to be home by 5 p.m. for dinner, and then he grabbed a light jacket and ran out the door. Shawn was known as a good kid who was responsible beyond his years. While Pam and Shawn's biological father hadn't been together for many years by that point, Shawn and Craig had developed a special relationship. When Shawn was just 6 years old, he walked his mother down the aisle and gave her away during Pam and Craig's wedding. And over time, he became like Craig's little shadow. Wherever Craig went, Shawn was usually not too far behind, even as he grew older and began to approach his teenage years. All of that was about to change, though. Shawn grabbed his bike outside and began to pedal down the gravel country roads toward his friend's house. And suddenly, a white pickup truck that was coming down the road veered toward him and knocked him off his bike. The driver then quickly exited the truck and rushed over to Shawn, but the purpose of this wasn't to see if he was okay. Instead, he quickly picked the child up and threw him in the truck before tossing his bike in the back and speeding off down the gravel road. In the blink of an eye, Shawn had been taken. Sometime later, when they learned that Shawn never showed up at his friend's house, Craig and Pam panicked and immediately called the police to report their son missing. Within hours of his disappearance, the town of Richwoods was crawling with sheriff's deputies and volunteers hoping to find some sign of the young boy along the route he would have taken that day. Dogs were also brought out, and while they did pick up Shawn's scent, it went nowhere. The search continued in the days that followed, and as the days became weeks, officials started to pull back on the effort. As they did, Craig cashed in his 401k retirement plan and everything they had ever saved and put all the money toward finding Shawn. They eventually set up a foundation in Shawn's name to aid in the search for missing children, but tragically, the search for their own continued to go on without any developments. In that time, newspapers and TV stations, even those about 55 miles away in St. Louis, picked up the story of Shawn's disappearance, but soon enough, that started to wane too. Even still, St. Louis investigators chased down more than 400 leads that came in, and the search would go in every direction. They searched caves, rivers, strip mines, abandoned farms and trailers, cemeteries, and they even drained lakes, hoping to find any sign of Shawn. Their every effort, however, turned up nothing, and after a year had passed, the team working the case began to face the very real possibility that Shawn would never be located, and if he was, it was unlikely he'd be found alive. Meanwhile, Shawn was not only alive, but was living a complete nightmare. The man who took him drove him back to his one-bedroom apartment in Kirkland, about an hour away from Richwoods, and from the moment he arrived there, the man had tied him to a futon and kept his mouth covered in duct tape. During this time, he was subjected to horrific, depraved acts of all kinds. After days of this, Shawn was granted some level of freedom in captivity. The man would untie him from the futon and allow him to roam the apartment at will while the man was home. When he would leave, however, Shawn would once again be bound to the futon and left to wait for the man to come home. After a few weeks of this, his kidnapper suddenly and unexpectedly told Shawn that he was going to take him home to his family around the end of October. So one day, the two got into the man's truck, but he didn't drive Shawn home. Instead, he took him out to a desolate logging road, and along the way, Shawn became extremely alarmed. The driver soon parked, got out of the vehicle, and came to the passenger side where he ripped Shawn from the seat and pulled him to the back side of the truck. He then wrapped his hands around Shawn's throat while he frantically pleaded for his life. He tried to fight, but the 6'4", 300-pound man was just too strong. As this was happening, Shawn promised that he'd do anything the man wanted as long as he didn't kill him, and upon hearing this, his grip on Shawn's neck started to loosen a bit. He suddenly dropped his hands, leaving Shawn free to gasp and catch his breath after coming close to blacking out. The man then agreed to let him live, but only on several conditions. Shawn had to promise that he'd never try to contact anyone or try to run away. If he did, the man would find him and kill him. And after the attempt on his life behind the truck, Shawn knew the man was serious about what he'd do if he ever tried to free himself, so he agreed, and the two got back in the truck and returned to the Kirkland apartment. As time passed afterward, Shawn continued to earn more privileges. The first was that the man stopped tying Shawn to the futon when he left the apartment. In those moments of peace, Shawn would pass the time most often by sleeping. Then, about 7 months after he was taken, Shawn was allowed to make friends with a 13-year-old neighbor named Tony. As the two got to know each other, Shawn spent a lot of time with the family, and never once did he mention his real identity. Instead, he repeated a carefully crafted script given to him by the man. He would go on to tell the family that his name was Shawn, but that his mother died in a car accident involving a drunk driver, and so now it was just him and his father. Tragically, the months of horrific treatment that he continually faced had effectively made Shawn a captive in his own mind, despite the fact that he actually had the ability to safely reveal the truth of what happened to him at any time. He even joined the family at restaurants, and they even took him to different events, including balloon races. They grew so close, in fact, that they'd have holiday celebrations together, but the agreement Shawn made to never run and never tell was one that he was holding firm to. And at the same time, the family never saw reason to question him, as the man appeared to be a great father who never left Shawn wanting for anything. He bought him a new bike and a video game system, and the two appeared to have a close and healthy relationship. And unfortunately, this would result in this horrifying ordeal going on for years. In 2006, 4 years after his abduction, Shawn would have several more prime opportunities to free himself from his captor, but he never took advantage of them. One day, he and Tony were riding their bikes around the neighborhood after the town curfew, and they were stopped by police officers. The two friends were then escorted back home, and never once did Shawn mention who he was. And simultaneously, the officers, despite the news surrounding Shawn's disappearance, didn't recognize him either. On another occasion, Tony's family was sitting in their living room with Shawn, and the television was turned to the local news station. Suddenly, Shawn's face was flashed on the television screen, accompanied by a story about his disappearance. Tony's mother then immediately looked over at Shawn, who was sitting in a chair staring back at the image of himself on the screen, and she asked if that was him. He then responded by laughing and denying that he was the Shawn the reporters were talking about. By that point, he was 15 years old, so some of his features had changed from the photo of himself at 11 years old, making it just plausible enough that they weren't the same person. So tragically, the issue was then dropped and never mentioned again. Sometime later that same year, Shawn actually came across the foundation website his parents had set up in his name. On it, there was a contact form that Shawn would go on to fill out twice. In neither message did he identify himself as their son, but both emails contained the same one-sentence question, which read, "How long are you planning to look for your son?" But unfortunately, neither of Shawn's parents ever responded to either inquiry. As one missed opportunity followed the next, it appeared unlikely that Shawn was ever going to be reunited with his real family, but something happened in 2007 that made him suddenly fearful that his time alive was running short. One day, the man came home with a new boy that Shawn viewed as his replacement. In January of that year, 13-year-old Ben got off a school bus in Franklin County and started walking toward home. A 15-year-old classmate named Mitch got off at the same stop and started walking in the opposite direction, but he whipped back around when he suddenly heard the squealing of car tires. When he did, he saw a white pickup truck speeding away from where Ben was just walking. And as soon as he got home, he told his parents about what he saw, and they notified Ben's family, who called the police immediately. Just like in the case of Shawn's disappearance, a thorough search ensued, but there was no sign of Ben. What police did find, however, were perfectly preserved tire tracks on the gravel road, believed to be from the pickup truck that took him. Casts of the tracks were then made, but police had no idea at the time that Ben's disappearance was about to break the case of Shawn's disappearance wide open. As the search for Ben was getting underway, investigators met up with Mitch to get as much information from him about what he saw as they could. And what they ended up getting was much more than they hoped for. So much, in fact, that they initially didn't believe him. In the course of a split second, Mitch had somehow managed to ascertain that the truck was a Nissan with a camper top, an elongated window down the side, and a 2-inch trailer hitch. He also said that there was rust and dirt all over the fender. Incredibly, about the only thing that Mitch didn't get was the truck's license plate. FBI agents who sat in on the interview were stunned by what Mitch was telling them. It's highly unusual to get this much detail from a witness, let alone a witness in his teenage years, but Mitch just so happened to be obsessed with pickup trucks. He could spot the broadside of a truck for a split second and list off any number of specs about it just by sight alone. Mitch was so sure of what he saw, and he convinced police that everything he told them was accurate, which instilled a lot of confidence in authorities. So as soon as they had the details down, officials released an all-points bulletin, or APB, out to the entire state of Missouri, asking officers and the public to be on the lookout for any vehicle matching the description. And just a couple of days after Ben was taken, the news was running a story about the disappearance as a pizza shop owner stared at the TV screen during a lull in work. When he heard the description of the vehicle police were looking for, his blood ran cold. He turned to look outside the pizzeria, and there it was, the white Nissan truck with a camper top and trailer hitch. Its fenders were even covered in road dust as if it had recently been driven down gravel roads, which was highly odd for a place like Kirkland. The pizza shop owner then thought back to a few days earlier, and he recalled the day of Ben's disappearance. It coincided with the day 41-year-old Mike Devlin, who was the restaurant's manager and owner of the truck, left early because he was feeling ill. This lead then came into investigators, and on January 12th, FBI Special Agent Lynn Willett arrived at the Kirkwood Pizza Shop with another agent and got into the lunch line. Behind the counter, serving customers, was Mike, and as soon as he spotted the agents, he never once looked up at them again. When it was their turn in line, the agent stepped up to the counter and told Mike that they needed to talk. He then nodded his head, almost as if he knew what this was about, and led them out to the back of the restaurant where the truck they had been looking for was parked. They asked for consent to search the vehicle, and he gave it. While Lynn's partner was having a close look through the truck, it started to rain, so Lynn and Mike retreated to the back seat of the FBI car for a formal interview. As Mike began to field Lynn's questions, he talked in circles, and things weren't making sense. Not only that, but Mike kept bringing up someone he referred to as his godson named Shawn. As Mike and Lynn were turned to face each other, she also had a good enough look at her suspect to actually see his pulse pounding through his neck. Every time he'd bring up Shawn, his pulse would quicken, and Lynn initially couldn't figure out why. After going back and forth for about an hour or so about where he went after he left work sick and what he did in the days afterward, the realization hit Lynn with such force that she almost physically reacted. She already knew that she must be speaking with the man who took Ben, but the Shawn he was referring to must have been the Shawn missing from years earlier. Lynn then tried her best not to let Mike know what she suspected as she brought up the topic of tire tracks. When she mentioned that police took casts of the tracks found at the scene of Ben's disappearance, Mike's face lost its color. It was at this point that she knew she had him. Lynn then continued to press Mike, explaining to him that tire tracks were similar to DNA and that matches could be made to a degree of certainty that not even the best lawyers could argue against. This was the bit of information that cracked him. Mike then dropped his head and uttered, quote, "I'm a bad person," end quote, before launching into his detailed confession of how he took both Ben and Shawn. Right away, Lynn asked him to take them where he was keeping them. So from the backseat, Mike gave turn-by-turn directions to the agent behind the wheel until they arrived outside his apartment complex. When they got to his front door, Lynn told Mike to go in first so that it wouldn't alarm either of the boys. The door then opened and Mike stepped inside, followed by the two agents. Both boys were on the floor in front of the TV playing video games together, and they suddenly paused their game and whipped their heads around. When Ben saw Lynn, he got up and ran right into her, almost knocking her over and trying to bail right past her out the apartment door. Shawn, meanwhile, was frozen. He didn't know what was going on until Lynn looked at both of them and told them they were safe. Mike was then immediately placed in handcuffs and hauled off to jail, while Shawn and Ben were transported to the police station. Once they arrived, investigators called each of their parents to inform them that their sons had been found alive. When Craig and Pam got the news, they could hardly believe what they were hearing. The officer who spoke to them said that he was 95% sure that the other boy was Shawn, leaving a bit of uncertainty as Shawn had changed so much in the 4 years, 3 months, and 6 days he was held in captivity. Craig and Pam then raced to the police station, and when they arrived, they were led into the room where Shawn sat by himself. When the door opened, he picked up his head and saw his parents for the first time since October 6th, 2002. Craig and Pam then hugged Shawn for what seemed like 30 full minutes. Obviously, none of them wanted to let go. Next door, Ben and his parents were experiencing the same joyful reunion. Mike was then indicted in 4 different jurisdictions for all the crimes he committed against Shawn and Ben, including the attempted murder of Shawn in 2002. In St. Louis County alone, Mike was hit with 71 total felony charges, with the first 18 relating to Ben and the last 53 pertaining to his prolonged treatment of Shawn. He initially pleaded not guilty, but on October 6, 2007, 5 years to the day of Shawn being taken, the prosecution announced that Mike would plead guilty after he learned that police recovered photos and videotapes from his apartment. For his crimes, Mike received 74 life sentences and an additional term of 2,020 years for a total sentence of 4,240 years. The first time he'll be eligible for parole, Mike would have to be 100 years old. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a member of the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.